Hello there, fair podcast listener, and welcome to this episode 29 of the Emotion at Work podcast. Before we get into the podcast proper, there are a few things that I wanted to do. I wanted to make a couple of apologies, share some appreciation, and then make a request. So a couple of apologies. So one is, it's very rare. I don't think I've ever overly edited an episode of the Emotion at Work podcast until this one. So when I started recording, I was looking at the waveform on the audio recording device I use, thinking that doesn't look very big, and then I realized that the microphone I selected wasn't the one that was in front of my face. It was the one that was about a meter away, so I'm a bit tinny for the first, say, 3 minutes, and then in the background I then closed down that recording, opened up a new one, and then you'll hear me much clearer, much like I am now. So apologies for the audio quality right at the beginning. It picks up as it gets a bit better after about 2 or 3 minutes, I think, of the podcast going. Second apology is the sporadicness of my publications recently. So normally I like to publish every 2 weeks on a Thursday. Every other Thursday is my goal, and I've not hit that for a while. As the regular listeners of the podcast will know, I've had some trials and tribulations with moving house, and as you'll hear about more in the episode to come, I've moved house. Yay! But what that's meant is that I've had other priorities that I needed to focus on that wasn't recording additional podcast episodes. Plus, I was without the internet for a while, so that made it a little bit tricky too. My appreciation then is I'm always blown away by the fact that this podcast gets between 150 and 200 listens every week. And I just wanted to say thank you very much, loyal listeners, for your support and for sticking with the Emotion at Work podcast. It picks up new followers every week, and its listening numbers get bigger and bigger every week. So I just wanted to say thank you for sticking with the podcast. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or recommendations for guests or anything like that, then please, or areas you want us to talk about or explore, then please let me know. And then my request. So it looks like this podcast works well for the listener in the way that I see it being shared online, the comments that I get back both anecdotally to me, but also what I see people sharing when they share the podcast. The listener numbers are high. The number of new listeners that we pick up is increasing, and followers of the podcast increase as well. So what my request is, if you'd be willing, please share the love for the Emotion at Work podcast by leaving us a review and rating us, whether that be on iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, Podbean, or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. If you leave us a review, it helps other people find the great content that you already enjoy. And that's it from me. Episode 29, we're continuing with our linguist theme. So we've got another linguist on as a guest this week to add to the other ones that we've had on before, because I think it's a much needed to be explored topic. So episode 29, here we go. Hello and welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And I'm very excited today because today's episode is building on a number of aspects that have been covered off in previous episodes of the podcast. Also, though, it's picking up on some of the things that I think are so common in the workplace, especially in workplace in teams, and then also in wider organisational cultures. And also, as the majority of my listeners, I think, are working in kind of the human resources or training and development type or organisational development and change world, I think the topics that we're going to be discussing today are going to be particularly relevant for our audience. So I'm very excited about where we're going to go today. So we're taking a linguistics angle. So already on the podcast in the past, we've had Samuelana, who came on and talked about forensic linguistics. We also had Jessica Robles come to talk about interaction, and we've had Professor Dawn Archer on, and then there's me been talking about some interactional aspects as well. And so today our guest is also from the research background, and that is Mr. Derek Bagsfield. So let's get him on the air. So hello Derek, how are you?
I'm fine, Phil, and thank you very much indeed for having me on today.
I'm very, very excited to have you on today. I'm really looking forward to what we're going to talk about. But before we get there, let's keep the listeners in suspense. So always I open the Emotional Work podcast with an unexpected yet innocuous question.
Okay.
And a couple of weeks ago, I went out to Twitter and said, I need to build out my bank of questions. Give me some suggestions, big wide world. And today's one comes in from Christine Loker.
Okay.
And she's at Christine Loker on Twitter, so a nice, easy Twitter handle if you wanted to find her. And her unexpected yet innocuous question is, if you had lots of money, what would you never outsource and why?
Wow, that's interesting. If I had lots of money, what would I never outsource and why?
Mm-hmm.
The flippant version of me would basically say going on holiday, because obviously that's something you can only experience yourself. And if I had lots of money, that's what I'd be doing. That's what I'd be doing. However, if we're talking about this from a professional rather than a personal perspective, if I had
it can
lots
be
of
either,
money,
to be fair.
well, if it's professional, then obviously I wouldn't outsource basically the way in which I choose to go on holiday with my family, because we love to do that ourselves. But if it's, so that's the personal, obviously we would, and we would engage in a series of not just basically foreign holidays, but a series of experiences, kind of cycling, lake canoeing, all these kind of things that we've done on occasion when we've had time and resource, but we just don't get an opportunity to do often enough. But if it's professional, from a professional working perspective, if I had a huge amount of money, or ideally an unlimited amount of money, what would I not outsource? It's got to be it's got to be the expertise that I see in my team, and the passion that they actually bring, and the commitment they actually bring to teaching, to research, to knowledge exchange. These things are really hard to find, easy to lose if mishandled, and they're things that you simply cannot outsource with any surety that you're going to get the same level of passion, commitment, and therefore effect and response. So it's literally those things which are impossible to outsource are, basically the absolute. It's all of that kind of wealth of experience and that wealth, and what comes with it, the kind of the passion that comes with it from your colleagues. That's simply, you can outsource it, but what you then tend to do is you then lose a significant amount of effectiveness.
Okay, I like that. That's really good.
Okay.
So I have a slight advantage. I also now have a slight disadvantage in that, because I say it's an unexpected yet innocuous question, but I get to see it in advance because I choose it. So I hadn't thought about it from a professional point of view. So I'm going to start with that, because that's the unexpectedness for me. And I think it would be.
Go on, you've got me in suspense now.
Yeah, so I'm trying to decide what would it be. So I think it would definitely be the interaction with other people. So if there's one thing I enjoy most, it's enjoying conversations and discussions and exploration with people, whether that be in a coaching capacity or in a consulting way, that sort of stuff. Because there's plenty of things that are easy to come to mind that I would outsource. Admin, but I think professionally it would be interacting with other humans, because that brings me a lot of joy. Now, if it was personally, I came at it from a really different angle. Mine would be cooking. So I'm absolutely adamant that you should outsource ironing. I'm adamant that nobody in their life should ever have to iron ever. Because it's the devil's work.
I agree to an extent, but I'm going to come across as somebody who really likes ironing. I don't, but ironing is instrumental in my household. When we're divvying up the work tasks, let me just put it this way: whoever's ironing gets to choose what's on the TV, on the big TV in the front room. So, if there's something you really want to watch, then basically you volunteer to do the ironing, and then everybody else either has to sit through what you want to watch, or they have to go and find something else to do. So I'm a bit of a geek. I've been quite happily watching the ITV run through of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings series. I was ironing on Saturday night purely on the basis that I wanted to watch Lord of the Rings Two Towers, because that happened to be on ITV from 8 o'clock, through till kind of 11 o'clock.
Okay.
So there you go. You see, I understand what you're saying. Ironing wouldn't be my first choice of one of the things that I'd need to do. However, what it did do is it got me some quality time on our relatively new TV that we've got on the wall. So there you go.
So
What can I say? Instrumental. Sometimes you just got to do things which you don't otherwise want to do because it actually has a benefit for you or for others down the line. And that's really the way in which I view ironing. Though, if I could find a way of basically securing in my house where I am outnumbered, basically 4-1, if I could, and that includes the cat, who's also female, but if I could find a way of actually securing the TV without having to iron, then trust me, I'd do it. But this is the most effective way of doing it. So that's not necessarily something I'd outsource because it's a means to an end.
Yeah, see, that still doesn't sway it for me.
Fair enough. I'll give it
No,
you
have. That was a very good attempt. Someone else in the past has described it as quite mindful for them. They find it quite therapeutic in that way. Whereas cooking is that therapeutic thing for me. I just get lost in cooking. Opening the fridge and saying, right, what have we got, and then creating something that tastes really good.
Yeah.
I really enjoy.
Well, I'm pleased that you said that because unfortunately, and this is going to sound horribly traditional, but for me, the extent of cooking for me is warming stuff up. However, basically my wife and both of my kids actually find the creative aspects of cooking to be incredibly rewarding. They find it doubly rewarding because the deal is that if they're cooking, I'm the one cleaning the kitchen up afterwards. So basically everybody's happy. And I know that sounds horribly traditional, that basically I'm not the one who does cooking, but I'm not particularly good at it. I'm afraid to say I like cleaning the kitchen. I know that's a little bit sad, but it's a bit therapeutic. It's a bit therapeutic, and I view that as a price well worth paying for an absolutely fantastic meal with my family. But for me, cooking, everybody has their strengths. Unfortunately, that's not one of mine.
Yeah. No, I know that there's lots of sort of atypical things that are not my strength at all. I can't hang a shelf. It's just that anything to do with kind of working with my hands, I just find really, really tricky to do. I was chatting with we've just moved house. Also, regular podcast listeners will be pleased to know I've moved house. I'm now recording this podcast in my new home, which is amazingly exciting. I was chatting with our new neighbour, and he said, there's a fence that neither of us are sure whose fence it is, and the land registry can't help us and anything, all that sort of stuff. So we've just come to an agreement that it needs replacing, and we'll split the cost between us, and we'll just divvy it up, and we'll both agree what we're going to get instead, and so on and so on. And I said, when we get whoever we get in to do it, and he said, what do you mean get someone in to do it? Can't we do it? I was like, no. I'm going nowhere near that, He said, that's fine, because I'm a joiner by trade and I do lots of different building. I said, you know what, if you want to do that and if you're happy to construct it, then you fill your boots, but that is just nowhere near my strength in any way, shape or form. I'm useless when it comes to anything like that.
No, being a farmer's son, I should say that I'm absolutely fantastic with my hands. I can make any engine sing, and I can hang, kind of doors and shelves and things like that. Unfortunately, whilst I can turn my hand to hanging shelves, my father-in-law, who lives very close, is always the first one to arrive with toolbox and the demand for coffee in hand whenever we've got anything like that. And so I just let him get on with it, partly because he's significantly better at it than me, and partly because it's just I get an easy life that way.
So where I'm going to get, this wasn't my intentional link, but where I'm going to go with that, how I'm going to take that into today then is so after I left that conversation with my new neighbour, my wife said to me in jest, so did you walk away from that feeling really weak and feeble then? I don't know, what did she say? She didn't say weak and feeble. What did she say? Feeling a bit girly. That was it. She said, did you walk away from that feeling a bit girly? And I was like, no, actually, no. Because that's what he's good at. I know what I'm good at, and I'm okay with that. But and I think because of the relationship that my wife and I have, she could get away with that. But if that had been someone else, that might be different. So where I'm going with that then for the listener is that we're talking today about banter, about impoliteness, and about power. And I just thought that might be a nice way to take us from where we've been discussing so far, then into the topic at hand for today.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's a nice one, especially considering in similar situations. My wife said something similar to me as well, because I've got that kind of relationship with me. She'll say things like, basically, are you not feeling quite as manly as you otherwise could be? Could be because my dad's come across and fixed the door for you. And she'll put it like that: fix the door for you. For you, not for the family, but for you. And I'm usually, kind of like, no, I'm really comfortable with that. Basically, he's got his strengths, I've got mine. But it does talk to these kind of society's notions of identity and gender identity, and also your notions of competencies, competencies both in society and when you get into workplace environments, competencies about what somebody's professional aspects are. And then you've got all these kind of notions around identity, which include the kind of more sociological factors, as in age, as well, more sociological factors beyond gender, which includes age, which includes also notions of ethnicity, levels of education, where you're actually from. And we've got all of these kind of weird, what Roland Barthes called these kind of Barthesian myths, or rather these stories or societies that we as members of a society or culture tell ourselves is actually normal. And then if you're basically, getting into any kind of interaction, then your sense of self, your sense of identity, this notion of this both social and academic notion of what's called face, then becomes a particular issue. And I'm sure that your regular podcast listeners have come across the concept of face when you talked to Dawn Archer recently. So this notion of face is absolutely instrumental in notions of banter, because when you're actually doing banter, which is broadly defined, at least from an academic perspective, and I should point out just as an aside here that kind of academia doesn't try and force definitions on other people. It tries to take a descriptive view and tries to say this is what we feel that members of society are meaning when they're using terms like banter. Banter is often defined as things like insincere impoliteness, which it basically means is that if I know you very well, I may actually venture an insult to you on the understanding that you will recognise that it is insincere, because we are such close friends, because our mutual identity construction is so close that I can risk offending you, knowing full well that you will recognise it's me just simply poking fun for fun's sake. Now there's an inherent risk in that, because if I'm relying on you more potentially than other forms of communication to recognise what I'm trying to do, if you don't take that the way in which I intended, and that notion of intention is very problematic. Indeed. Of course, if you don't take that the way in which I've intended, that can cause either kind of damage to breakdowns of relations, or if it's in a workplace setting, a very uncomfortable and lengthy process with which you've got to talk through your explanations to colleagues in HR. So, and that has happened in the past in various professional settings of which I am aware. Yeah. So this notion of banter, when I put it like that, people may think, well, why on earth would you ever want to get it? You put yourself at risk like that. Well, banter in many ways is actually essential. It's essential for the construction and the maintenance of the construction of social groups. It's because it indicates when it's communicated and accepted for what it is. It indicates that not only are we cooperators, but we are so close as cooperators that potential damage to our relationship, A, will not work, and B, will not actually negatively impact the collective way in which we work together. So there are huge positives to have a healthy banter relationship, but there are also significant risks if you get it wrong, if it's overused, or if it's used where there is a disparity of power relations, if there's an asymmetry, as it's called, between power relations, or if there are sensitive sociological factors at work, either external or internal to the communication. For example, if somebody was to say to me, if I'd done something slightly wrong and somebody said to me, "Oh, you old fool," if I had suddenly then felt, or if I generally felt sensitive about my age, and ageism being a very real issue in workplaces in the UK, then ultimately that attempt at banter, saying something like, "Oh, you old fool," that's a fairly commonplace, a fairly innocuous thing to say. but people may actually take that, take offence of that. And if you start moving into notions of ethnicity or gender or region of origin or level of education, you've got a real potential for a very messy outcome where one was not intended.
Absolutely, and I think I can think of a number of examples from my professional past where there's been one joke. Well, the banter or the insincere impoliteness was around somebody being from Yorkshire and their propensity to spend money. And as the budget holder, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but essentially it was, oh, there we go, there's the Yorkshireman again. And it was, no, this isn't about me and my background or where I'm from. This is about the fact that you're being frivolous with money, and as the budget holder, I'm saying no. That's I think that's an irresponsible way of spending the cash. So this isn't about me being from Yorkshire and all the identity that brings with it. This is just about, in this example of what you're coming to me with a request for money for, I'm saying no because I don't think it's a worthwhile, or it's a spend we don't need to make.
Yeah, I mean, that example beautifully, I think, that example beautifully exemplifies the differences between banter, which is insincere impoliteness, and actually veiled, genuine impoliteness. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is that there is currently no linguistic way of distinguishing between the two. And that's really, I think, why you get so many people constructing offence where it may not have been intended, and then actually taking, and then genuinely feeling. I mean, we're not talking about people who are overly precious here, but we are talking about people who, basically, because there's no real linguistic way of differentiating between banter and basically impoliteness, which is masked as banter, if you see what I mean. So something which I want you to see it's banter, but it's actually barbed behind it. And there are many documented cases of that, and it really depends on, it's all down to context. It's down to, which includes notions of personality and identity, and we need to be aware that when somebody says something like that, oh, there's the Yorkshireman coming out again, or that's the Yorkshire and you coming out again. I've often theorised, and I need to do more research on this, that when you label something, there's a whole set of semantic meanings behind that label, which you then, in a strange sort of way, you then neatly package and then throw away. You see that in politics online nowadays. It's when somebody basically says, oh, if somebody defines somebody as a lefty or a remoaner, or the classic remoaner around the whole Brexit debate and the ongoing kind of sensitivities around, kind of the UK's leaving of the European Union. The moment somebody labels somebody else as a remoaner, uses a label, what it does do is it seems to indicate I can dismiss everything you've said. And that's a risk for labelling. So when somebody uses a label in banter, there's always an opportunity for somebody to think, oh, you are simply just trying to encapsulate everything which is meaningful about what I'm trying to say and then dismiss it as being meaningless. And so that's one of the fantastic, from an academic perspective, but horrific from an actual workplace perspective, understandings around how banter and its close linguistic associates work, i.e. things like, kind of impoliteness, which is masked as banter. And that's, I find it utterly fascinating. I guess in the same way an immunologist finds, kind of human lethal viruses utterly fascinating. It's not necessarily something you'd want to actually have to be inflicted on you, but it's something from an academic perspective I find absolutely fascinating, whilst understanding it can be, horrifically damaging.
Tell me more about labelling.
Labelling is a way of identifying, is a way of dismissing basically the points and the content of what people are actually saying. And so if you're actually using things like, oh, there's the Yorkshireman speaking, then that's potentially a way of dismissing somebody's otherwise valuable contribution to an interaction. Let me give you an example. Okay. I was explaining something to a team, one of the sub-teams within my own department, and a colleague who happened to be a female colleague, a senior lecturer in one part of one kind of fifth of my department. As I was explaining a particular issue, it was a relatively minor issue which I wanted the team to address. This particular colleague simply interrupted me, which itself is particularly a challenging thing to do. And then she said, "Oh, are you mansplaining?" And I immediately took offence at that. Now this colleague is known for her banter, and she said, "Is this you mansplaining to us?" And I immediately, kind of felt a flash of negative emotion at that. And in the end, I simply relatively tightly said, "No, I'm boss-splaining." So that's how I dealt with it. Now, I hate the term mansplaining, because that use of that label robs an entire gender, in the same way that womansplaining, which is now I'm starting to see online coming, womansplaining or mansplaining, they rob entire genders of their right to contribute. And that's why I dislike them, because I find, even though this particular colleague was attempting to use them, I realised very quickly in a banter type way, it didn't work at that particular point in time. I mean, I didn't censure her at any particular point in time. I didn't come down heavy on her. But it was that notion of that labelling, and so there's an issue to do with how you're using banter and how you're actually using banter, where you may use a label like Ramona, and if somebody is described as a Ramona, as I mentioned earlier on, it's almost like an excuse to say, I can now ignore everything that you're actually saying, because I've labelled you as a Ramona, and therefore what you're actually saying now has no value, even if it is a genuinely valid point. And so the use of labels in banter settings is particularly problematic.
And I think... do I think? I wonder, because I agree with you, whether... Sorry, lots of thoughts going on in my head. Let's take a breath. So I agree with you in that what labels the label that somebody used, then it makes it robs that individual of their agency, because it homogenizes them into a group that has certain characteristics in a real or perceived, as viewed by whoever is making that statement. Now, what I view, what I perceive, might be different to what the labeler has viewed or perceived, and I think then because you talked about context earlier on, I wang on all the time about how important context is, and it also then brings in that notion of the relationship between the individuals at play. Do I know, in your example, I feel that flash of you labelled it as negative emotion, whether it be anger or offence or whatever it was, at being accused of mansplaining. Yet you managed to catch that, cognitively reappraise it, and go, no, I need to remember that this lady in particular is known for her banter. Yeah. So I will then issue my response will be, no, I'm boss-splaining, not mansplaining. And you reframed the emotional response you had in that way. And I think if individuals that are either doing the banter, or receiving the banter, are if they're unaware, or they don't account for that contextual aspect, that can make life really, really tricky, and that's where those misunderstandings and miscommunications can come from. So I also want to take a few steps back, because I think we did a really good job of defining banter. But within that, then we use some words that I don't think many people would be that familiar with, and one of those was impoliteness. So can we, and that might mean that we have to define politeness as well to therefore have impoliteness. Sure. But I just wonder if it might be useful to define what they are.
Yeah, I mean, as with every academic term, these are hotly contested, and really, as academics now basically operate and have done for a number of decades now, we prefer to take a descriptive approach rather than a prescriptive approach. That basically means, what we mean by that is we like to look at what society at large understands by certain concepts and certain terms. Having said that, if you actually ask 100 people in the UK, what does impoliteness mean, you are likely to get close to 100 separate definitions, not all of which will actually co-occur. So impoliteness has both an academic and a basic non-academic set of understandings, and and so that's why we sometimes use the concept known as a technical term. And a technical term basically means this is what academics understand it as at this point in time, knowing full well that members of society at large may not fully recognise that definition. So there's my rider. If you see
that's fine. Yeah.
So impoliteness impoliteness as a technical term in an academic sense simply means that the use of linguistic terms and strategies which, if effectively communicated, cause offence or have the risk of causing offence to the recipients. Now, offence and politeness and impoliteness, these are considered to be mostly instrumental, if not entirely instrumental. Now, what instrumental actually means is they're a means to an end.
Yes.
Now, if you think about how we use politeness, we might like to think that we are polite for politeness' sake. We're not. We're polite because if I'm polite to you or you're polite to me, you are more likely to do what I'm asking you to do, or I'm more likely to do what you're asking me to do, or you require of me, or whatever, both immediately and longer term. So that's instrumental. The whole reason for being polite is it's a way of getting things done in society without us attempting to take big chunks out of each other. Because again, our face and our notions of identity are constantly at risk. Yep. So how do you mitigate? How do you reduce the impact? How do you acknowledge that somebody else's individuality, somebody else's individual identity and their face are intact? You use politeness. Now, from time to time, I mean, if you've been out in Manchester on a Friday night, you will probably see that not everybody is as polite to one another as we might otherwise, like to think or would want to happen. I mean, I'm not just picking on Manchester. That's basically every town and city in the UK. Every town and city in the UK. I mean, I'm originally from Kendal, and I can tell you, going out on a Friday night in Kendal when I used to do that, there were quite a few conflictive elocutions, I think is a technical term. I hear quite a few linguistic arguments. So I would say is people basically having a right old go at one another, both physically as well as linguistically, i.e. they were being impolite. They were using linguistic terms, they were using language in order to purposefully attempt to offend somebody else. That's what impoliteness means. And it tends to be viewed instrumental because when you start looking at things like army training discourse, army training discourse, whilst society at large wouldn't necessarily say, hey, that's impoliteness, because they wouldn't recognise it as such. It comes under the technical term of impoliteness, i.e. it is linguistically aggressive behaviour which is used instrumentally. Now, in British Army training and in American Army training, you will often find non-commissioned officers, i.e. sergeants and corporals, those who are training recruits, they will use aggressive language in no uncertain terms as a way of quickly encouraging the recruits to fit into the mould of the model soldier. Because if you do that and you get it right, those people will survive on a battlefield in high-stress situations. Now, that's an extreme form of instrumentality. But you can also see instrumental behaviour if you actually look at chef-to-chef interactions. And if you only actually have to look at any of the number of TV shows like, Hell's Kitchen or, or I remember from the late 1990s, a Channel 4 programme called Boiling Point, where you've actually got the head chef who's actually very, very aggressive towards the rest of the chefing staff, the rest of the brigade, as it's called, within the kitchen. It's done so because it's high stress, high stakes. They've got to move very, very quickly. They've got a reputation to uphold. And politeness takes time. Impoliteness, doesn't take quite as much time, and it nevertheless pushes forward the force of what you mean very, very quickly. So whilst politeness is a way of getting things done, sadly, impoliteness does seem to have more agency in getting things done. The downside is it gets things done more quicker, but at the cost of damaging personal and sometimes professional relationships.
And I think that there's and this is where you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting or misrepresenting anything now. So you have absolute kind of agency to correct me. So I think
I'll try and do so politely.
So as well as the aggression, though, impoliteness can be done through lack of politeness markers, I think. So if you would expect someone to use a formal title, so sir or madam or doctor or professor, and then they deliberately leave that out, when they call somebody by their first name. So it's a maybe a slightly trivial example, but my next door neighbour, who I was referring to earlier on, I talked about the male In the relationship, the female is a teacher, and she's the teacher at the local primary school where all three of my children up until recently have gone. So they're struggling with calling her by her Christian name in the house, and her by. So they're going. So when they've been round, we've only been in a week, 2 weeks, I think. But when yesterday and the day before, they went round and they were still calling her by her. Her teacher name, her, by Mrs. and then her surname, as opposed to her Christian name. So she was like, "Oh, no, just call me by my Christian name. It's absolutely fine. Just call me Ruth. It's fine." But they're struggling with that because they know they've learned that the politeness rules are that when I see that lady, I do it. Now, if they were then in
the precedent's been set.
Absolutely, and if they were then in school and accidentally called her Ruth, I'm sure she'd be fine about it. But if they were doing it then deliberately, that would be a form of impoliteness. So rather than so it's not aggressive in that way, but
no, absolutely,
no,
absolutely. I mean, it can be. And again, the hearer, the receiver, has to make a judgment call. And, when you make a judgment call, you're not always necessarily correct. And that's something we need to be aware of when banter goes wrong. But ultimately, you've got to make a judgment call. And, sometimes when you make a judgment call, you could be incorrect. But you've got to make a judgment call as to whether or not that was intended or not. I mean, for example, okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. When you introduced me on this, you said, you're really excited to talk to Mr. Bousfield. It's technically Dr. Bousfield. I wasn't going to mention it, but you brought the example up, so I will mention it. But you know what? You didn't know, so therefore, basically that's not even. It's not a microaggression, so therefore it's not like a what might be viewed as a micro example of impoliteness. It's not even rudeness, i.e., you're not giving me the attention or the respect that I'd otherwise want. You just simply didn't know. As simple as that. Let me give you another example. About 10, 12 years ago, I was teaching a bunch of first years at the institution I was working at the time, and it was at the end of the Freshers' Week, and I was giving them a session on the Friday, and I walked in, and some of them were still calling me, kind of Dr. Bousfield and this, and even though we told them all week, just call us Derek, just call us by our first names, because that closes the social distance between us and students. And some students find it very difficult, especially those that came through A-levels from school, coming to university. They assumed they'd actually have to call us by title and last name, and I said, no, just call us Derek. And then one of the students, I distinctly remember this, I've remembered it for years, and kind of gleefully told my children this, who think it's hilarious. And I came into the room and said, hi, basically, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Derek. And then one of the guys who'd heard me say all week, oh yeah, call me Derek, from the back, he just shouted up and he said, yeah, this is bearing in mind this is a first year who'd only just started. He then said, yeah, this is Derek. He said, but he says, you guys get to call him DK. Now everybody then started laughing. I've never been called DK in my life. Right, and everybody started laughing, and I turned around and basically said, well, I said, a number of people call me a number of different things. I said, but you guys do not get to call me DK. I said, you get to call me Derek. Simple as that. And then we just dealt with the situation that way. But it always struck with me that this one student felt so comfortable, he decided he would throw that one in. Now, he was attempting to use banter. I interpreted that as not an attempt to offend, but as an attempt to basically do banter, which failed. So ultimately, in hindsight, I would say it's probably a little bit rude. And he never called me DK again throughout his entirety of his career. And he ended up, he's a good student. He got a good degree at the end of it. But the fact is, it's like everything else. He tested the boundaries. I basically quietly put him back in his box, if you want to put it that way, and ultimately everything was good. So he attempted to use banter. It didn't quite work on me. I corrected this, and we've even had discussions, basically with students when we're teaching, kind of first year sociolinguistics, i.e. how society and language come together. I say to students, just introducing them to this notion of sociolinguistics. So think about how you talk to or how you address, basically, your mum and dad, your friends, even me. And then we talk about notions of address. For example, my nickname amongst my friends and my family is Des. Nobody outside of my friend group or my family calls me, calls me Des. Everybody in my family and friends group calls me Des. Nobody outside of that calls me Des. Now I've mentioned this to students, and then I've basically said you will actually have your own nicknames, which sound absolutely perfectly fine from family and friends group, but if I used the nickname to you, you'd be horrified. I said in the same way that none of you in this room get to call me Des ever, and that normally goes down really well. They kind of have lots of smiles, and those that get it never use it, and those that don't try and use it once, and then I'll have a chat with them about it. But it's just a way of basically getting these things across, and this indicates something which you mentioned earlier on, Phil, which is basically it's not so much what you say, it's who you're saying it to and what that relationship is like. That is hugely instrumental in the interpretation by any individual of what is meant to be banter and what is not taken as banter.
And I think in the workplace as well, we have to account for overhearers, who aren't necessarily the intended recipient of the banter. So it might, and I've had cases, within my HR experience, I've had cases where you have two individuals who have a relationship that they feel between them allows them to use particular language or terminology or terms of address or what they describe as terms of endearment. But then when you factor in overhearers, whether they be peers in the team or members of the public in one example, or others, that their interpretation of that then can be massively different to what those interlocutors may have, what those speakers, I should say, probably, are trying to do between them. Because the instrumentality of that is we're using these terms, or we're using these address terms, or we're using this phrase or these phrases because we know between us we can say that and it's okay. But then when you were then bringing an overhearer, and I've had it. One example was within a team, where somebody new joined the team. This banter happened in a team meeting, and they were mortally offended by the fact that people in a professional context would use the language that was being used in the way that it was being used. But it had been precedent in that team for a long time. So everybody was like, "Well, what's the issue? We've been doing it like this for ages."
I've got example after example after example, which I could tell you of that happening. And of course, one thing you've got to guard against. The thing is, fundamentally, banter is healthy. However, you've also got to guard against the fact that banter represents a particular cultural way of doing things. Now, when you've got new members of the team coming in, to expect them to simply knuckle down and accept and actually join in with that cultural aspect can actually be quite problematic. And that's something that new teams should really be gently asked to be away. If you've got a constant way of talking to one another, which outside of that group and outside of the long-term practice may actually be interpreted differently, I think you need to be mindful of that and need to be very clear of that with others. I can give you example after example of situations like that where the people overhearing it or people who have joined a group have actually seen something and they've been horrified about. I can give you example after example of that. I'll give you one example where this happened to a colleague of mine who was in his late 30s at another institution, and he had a habit of being on Facebook, and his policy was he never invited anybody, but he never refused anybody on Facebook. And because he was actually a very popular colleague amongst students at the institution he was working at the time, lots of students would actually invite him on Facebook and he would accept them. In hindsight, given his own experiences with HR about what I'm about to tell you, he subsequently is basically more circumspect. He's still on Facebook, but he does not actually accept new students, when they try and invite him up. So he just kind of leaves them there so they can't re-invite him and things like that. But in this situation, it was admittedly late at night. One of his students, who he knew very well, who'd actually done, who was an inspired student by all accounts, who'd done an awful lot of research and had worked with this particular colleague at another institution throughout her first year, second year, and her third year. Bearing in mind this colleague was male in his late 30s, and the student who was actually posting on Facebook, she said, she was basically 21, 22, and she said, "Eek, only 3 more," something along the lines of, I seem to remember this, because I was called in as an expert by this institution's HR to talk about this.
Right, okay.
She then said, "Eek, She said only 3 more weeks of my degree course. Slightly worried. Don't know what else. Don't know what I'm going to do with my life. Now, this particular colleague who'd been teaching her for 3 years, he then listed, because it's just the way in which he does things. He's incredibly bombastic. He listed 20 things in there that she could do, and then summarised with his sting in the tail, which was, "Or you could stay with us to pursue a master's." The problem was, one of the early things he'd actually suggested that she could do with her degree was pole dancer. Now,
right, okay.
It wasn't the student. Bearing in mind this is Facebook and it's a very public environment. It wasn't the student herself who'd received that took offence at that. It was a friend of hers that didn't know this colleague and had never had him as a tutor. She had taken her understanding of what a student-tutor relationship should be like, and found his comment of, pole dance. He'd also put in things like lion tamer, safari expedition leader, things that were equally beyond the bizarre, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's like, things like, jet fighter, test pilot. He'd done about a series of about 19 or 20 of these ridiculous things, and then he summarised with this, "Oh, you could stay with us to do a master's." And that was his particular point, and that was his particular defence. But the point was, a third party had taken offence on behalf of the student to whom that comment was directed, because she did not know the culture that was obtaining between this particular colleague and his particular students. And the student in question, the one to whom the pole dancing comment had been directed, had said, "I was not offended in any way, shape or form. This is just what," and then this particular colleague's name is like. He's just like that. And basically, it's simply not offensive. It's just who he is.
Mm.
So I mean, just coming back to kind of link on this one and other things, you may have seen that my Twitter handle is Dr. Wordyboy. Now, one of the reasons it's Dr. Wordyboy is that my family don't do this, but my friends who I've grown up with, people I went to primary school with and I'm still in contact with and meet, basically once every week or once every 2 weeks for a catch up, they will refer to me as Wordyboy. Simple as that.
Okay.
And I'm not offended, but they use this as a label. Thinking back to what I said earlier on about labels,
yeah.
They use this as a label, and they use this to basically, because I'm the only one of my friends group, not the only one who's been to university, but the only one of the friends group that's actually gone all the way through university and got a PhD and this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
My friends are now running. One's running his own building firm, another one's running his own electrical business, another one's basically selling. He's a co-partner in his own independent financial advice business. Another one's basically running running distribution for a major Northwest kind of organisation, a food distribution organisation.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all kind of friends who in their own fields that they've by their own definition made a success of themselves. But they signal to me, interestingly enough, that my particular experiences and expertises, basically in their view are no more or less valuable than their own. By every time they come up with something and I say, well, actually from a definitional point of view, or if I say anything that's vaguely linguistically, go, here we go, he is a wordy boy, or they will turn to me and say, they say, come on, wordy boy, we're paying your wages, what does this mean? Mm-hmm. Or something along these lines. And occasionally people who aren't within that kind of the centre of that kind of that group, where you've got more peripheral members, will actually get quite offended by, and in the past they have done, they've got quite offended hearing this and thinking, they shouldn't be talking to you like that. And it's like, well, okay, so there's society says academics should be viewed in this way, but I've grown up with these people. I've actually seen them, sitting on the floor with a grazed knee, crying at age 5, that kind of stuff. So it's, there's a history there that you dismiss, at your peril. And for me and my friends group, given that we are basically a very close-knit friends group and have been for more decades than I care to remember in some ways, I think that probably has more weight amongst the group of us. That doesn't mean to say that we don't fall out. We occasionally do. Other things that we've actually said, but significantly less as time goes on.
Yeah, but I guess there's also an instrumental aspect as well to it, though, isn't it? As well as I guess elements of banter / faux mocking. There's also some endearment within that. Because
there is. There's a huge amount of endearment. They wouldn't. They call me Wordy Boy. I mean, I call the one who runs his own the electrical business Sparky. And it's it's simple as that. And we'll occasionally basically round on another of my colleagues, the one who sells he's independent financial advice. We'll occasionally round on him and say, well, at least we're doing something productive. You sell fear. You sell fear of the future. You sell fear of getting old and things like that. And we'll have those kind of comments. But yeah, there is always a sense of endearment. But there's a game-like quality to it as well. At least within my friends group, there's a term of endearment, as in I can say these things to you because we have been friends for more than 40 years in some cases. Because we've been friends for more than 40 years, we know how we each tick, and we know what presses buttons and how far we can press them. But also there's and this could actually be gender-specific identity construction. Doing laddishness. Even though now we're actually in our mid to late 40s, if you see what I mean. We're still doing laddishness. There's a game-like quality to it. It's when we're engaging in banter. How good can the banter be before it? How near the knuckle can it be before it actually gets? How close can you get it before it actually tips over into something serious? Yeah. There's a real game-like quality with that. How far can you push it? That kind of thing. Though there are obviously a few things that are off-topic. These things being basically nobody in my friends group, and as far as I can see in the research that the data that I've seen, nobody in anybody else's ever says anything negative about the children of everybody else. You just don't do it. There are some things which are totally off topic. Yeah. So it's basically it's children, parents, kind of deceased friends or family members. None of these things are ever basically pushed. However, basically, if you've got colleagues, if you've got friends, I should say, who've got itinerant girlfriends or things like that, they're not off topic. If you've got people who are friends of friends, they're not off topic. If you've got things where people have tried to do something and been either successful or unsuccessful, they're not off topic. So there are some things which can be very, very close and near the knuckle. There are other things which, it's almost like self-regulation in terms of banter. There are things which you just do not mention. And even if they were mentioned in a banter-like setting, the group quickly shuts those kind of things down.
Yeah. I'm trying to think now if there's any other. Would in my experience, are there any other kind of taboo or unallied topics? But I'll save that one for later, I think.
Sure.
So I want to do a bit of a summary. I don't want to put it together yet because I also want to talk about power because we haven't talked about power yet. But I guess I think it might be useful just to bring together where we're at then. So we talked about how banter is. Give me your description again. So banter is.
Oh well, banter is insincere impoliteness.
Wonderful. And it is intended and interpreted in that way.
When it's successful, it's intended and interpreted in that way, yes.
And banter is a healthy thing because it signals closeness in relationships. It signals understanding of other people within that context and environment.
And it signals the strength of the relationship as well as there's a huge endearment, affection element to it as well. Mm-hmm. The problem is, like anything else, it can misfire, and if it misfires, then everything you're attempting to achieve, which includes reaffirming, re-strengthening the social bonds, showing endearment, you could actually have, if you're unlucky and if you've mishandled it, the complete opposite effect.
Okay. So that then brings us back into the impoliteness bit then. So that's where things are done to either aggravate or offend or threaten or be aggressive towards or something in that way, and using most commonly linguistic. I wonder if there's some paralinguistic as well, but we'll come back to that later.
There's definitely paralinguistic.
So, but using linguistic or paralinguistic strategies to do that. On the contrasting side of that, then there's politeness, where we are doing either linguistic or paralinguistic things to grease the wheels, I call it. So they're things that grease the wheels of conversation or grease the wheels of actions and future kind of working and relationships. And both politeness and impoliteness then can happen within interaction with other people, and then banter is the insincere aspects of impoliteness.
Yeah.
So what if we then added, as much as Venn diagrams are often overused, if I then added a third aspect to that. So if one of my circles in my Venn diagram is impoliteness, another one of those then is banter, because you can do impoliteness and be doing banter, and you can do impoliteness and not be doing banter. If we then bring power into it as well, then what does the research tell us about how power kind of interplays or overlaps with those other two aspects?
It interplays and overlaps very, very carefully. The reason being is that the power asymmetry, because the theory and the practice seems, and the data seems to suggest that people who are more powerful within hierarchies, organisations and structures don't have to use as much politeness, all other things being equal, than those who are more powerless. Okay. That then sets up a series of expectations, so that if a more powerful person is attempting to use banter with somebody who's more powerless, that can actually therefore be assumed, or it can sometimes be interpreted, or is more readily interpreted, as actually being sincere rather than insincere. And so therefore banter from basically somebody who's in a senior boss type position coming down the structure is much more high risk. Mm-hmm. And so that doesn't stop people who are slightly lower than basically the person who is a kind of in a managerial position from using banter, or attempting to use fairly light or significantly more innocuous banter towards that particular colleague. But again, that can sometimes be interpreted as a challenge to authority and a challenge to position. So the summary of the particular situation, on the understanding that significantly more research is actually needed, is that where power becomes more of a differential, then banter is used very carefully.
And so is banter used? So if I can, I guess I want to play with a contrast of that. Then. So can banter be used by those without power, without hierarchical power in that way? So if you've got, you mentioned you've got a team which is made up, I think, of 5 different areas. So if I just imagine that's 5 different people, if somebody within your team then was attempting to use banter as a way of exercising or demonstrating power, is that a thing?
Yeah, it is, and it's definitely a thing. Banter, in many ways, it may be that banter is rarely ever used just for the purposes of strengthening the social bonds, showing that we are cooperators and that very little will actually challenge us. It comes back to this notion I mentioned earlier on about the game-like quality. In a game, if you think about a traditional game, there is usually one winner, or one set of winners. So the moment banter starts to overlap with game-like qualities, then there is a sense that power is therefore up for contestation, and banter could be one of the mechanisms by which somebody gains either local or long-term, either short-term or long-term notions of power and influence. So banter, like any other linguistic tool, is a tool for instrumentality, i.e. getting things done. Mm-hmm. And if you're the person who's controlling getting things done, then you are de facto the person in power.
Yes, because and that's the. So I have And I don't think I disagree. I don't think you and I will disagree. We haven't talked about this, but I don't think we'll disagree.
No.
So I think power is something that is much more dynamic than I think is often given credit for. So I think the general narrative is that if you're in a position, if you're in a hierarchy and you are above other people, therefore you have the power. And sure. I don't buy that necessarily.
No,
I think that does happen, but I think it's much more dynamic than that. And power is something that moves and changes from sometimes from utterance to utterance, but also it can be from topic to topic or context to context.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, this is a whole other podcast, and probably with somebody who's done more work on language and power than myself, though I've done a little bit. Yes, there is often a view in society that power is hierarchical and it's concrete in institutions, and that's simply not true. We use the concept now I don't think any of you podcast listeners would actually, not recognise the fact that people can be what's called upwardly managed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind being upwardly managed on the basis that I've got colleagues here who are teaching German, French, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Mandarin, as well as linguistics, TESOL, digital media and communications, multimedia journalism. I'm not a journalist. I don't speak German. I need to be upwardly managed because they have more power in their particular fields of expertise than I do. So that I require them to be more powerful and more knowledgeable in the areas of German, Spanish, Italian, journalism, because I've got to manage these particular teams. I've got to lead these teams, but they actually have more expert power in those particular areas. I've just got to balance their demands, their needs from an expert power perspective with the university's own allocation of resources in order to ensure that everybody gets the best out of this, and that we're not basically running the program at a financial or any other loss. Students get the very best experience that we can actually provide them, and that resources are appropriate to the task at hand. And that absolutely relies on people having different types of power and bringing them together in a meaningful way. So I absolutely agree with you that we need to move away from this overly simplistic view of power as being top-down hierarchical. It is diffuse, and I agree with you entirely, and the research would agree with you, Phil, that power changes from utterance to utterance, from minute to minute, from topic to topic.
And I guess with that then is and this I think comes back to my very eloquent question of is that a thing question that I made a few minutes ago, which is that I then think I have experienced then banter as an instrument that somebody is using to get some or to assert some power of some description in some way, and where there's two other aspects I want to link into that. So one is whether it's effective. So is it perceived as banter, as insincere impoliteness, or have they left themselves what I call wriggle room? And that's where I think linguistically I see a lot of banter trying to play in that wriggle room way, where you're not really sure. Is that banter, or is that an insult, or what you and I might call impoliteness? But what it does is it gives the speaker enough wriggle room to say, "Oh no, that was just bants."
Yeah, I mean, I suspect there's a huge amount of that. I mean, wherever you get indirectness in language use, then people are attempting, in one way or another, whether or not they fully realise it or not, they will be conscious at some point that they're giving themselves what's called plausible deniability, i.e. that they are saying that, I was only intending it as such and such, not how you've taken it. And if you've taken it that way, then basically that was not intended, and that's really now becomes more of your problem. And I suspect that's a common defence, especially in workplace settings where you've got instances of interactions gone wrong, or genuine instances of banter gone wrong, or instances where somebody's attempted to get a bit near the knuckle with somebody and it's not been quite pitched rightly, and rather than them gaining instrumentality of power over the other person by using what appears to be a contender for banter, it's actually basically being responded to in a more negative way. I think, ultimately there's a lot of that can go on. And so, if anybody was actually hoping for a really clear response to basically what is and is not banter, I'm afraid, we're not there yet, if we're ever going to be there.
Yeah, and I think your ending, if we're ever going to be there, is an accurate one, because you're never going to know, because I might, I can say, that wasn't my intention, where actually it was my intention, but I don't want to own that, because if I own that then opens up a whole other type of conversation or a whole other aspect of it, because yes, I did want to communicate my displeasure or my my frustration or my sarcasm or whatever it was, and I often hear in people talking about there's intent versus impact, and what did you intend, and then what was the actual impact that it had? And I can tell you what my intent was, but it doesn't mean that was actually what my intent is. And I remember there was one case in particular where I was running the investigation, and it was about a number of misunderstandings. And if you aggregated up the number of those misunderstandings and some of the similarities of those misunderstandings, actually that led to at least sketch out a picture where it was hard for the individuals to say that wasn't my intention. So arguably they could have got away with it once, but with the number of occurrences that we had, actually, it was harder for them to maintain that line. This is where we then get back into the face aspects of things. It was harder for them to maintain a line of unintentionality, when actually, when you look at these different examples over time, that would suggest that there's some intentionality there.
Yeah, no, I think you're on that. I would actually agree with in principle. And one thing I think we need to remember is that words, whether written or uttered, once written or uttered, no longer belong to the speaker or the writer. It's as simple as that. I mean, if you think about it, when you speak or when you write and press send on an email, you are giving those words to somebody else. So they therefore take at least partial ownership of those. And given that language is imperfect, all naturally occurring languages are wonderfully, beautifully, horribly imperfect in terms of communicating our full intent and our full meaning, then ultimately you need to be aware that words no longer belong to the producer of those words. They belong as equally to the receiver of those words. So we need to guard against these, kind of ancient linguistic theories of, the producer owns these words and it's what they intended. We also equally need to guard against what have been postmodern theories in linguistics about, it's what the hearer does with them that counts, because that completely then backgrounds the speaker.
Yes.
This is essentially This is essentially a 50-50 or more or less 50-50 split between both the producer and the receiver, or the speaker and the hearer, if you want to put them in more simple terms. I remember kind of Voloshinov or Bakhtin saying, "My word is a bridge between myself and another." If we want to understand that quotation to its full understanding, then ultimately it's literally, basically, whilst my word is actually a means of communication, it rests equally as strongly on both banks of that river, if you see what I mean, both banks of the river of communication. And so ultimately, I think we probably need to accept that a speaker may or may not claim that's not what I intended. The intention is one thing; it's the uptake and the effect on the receiver and the relationships now between speaker and hearer that's also as equally important, I think.
Yeah, and that's where you get into things like backhanded compliments. So what's the it gets really interesting. You'll know, because it was part of a special edition of the journal that you put out, but the ways that individuals can give compliments. I guess we're moving slightly away from banter in that way, because they weren't doing it in a bantery in a bantery way, but giving a compliment by disparaging someone else is there's endless examples of ways that we linguistically try and do things, and I guess that's back to the imperfection that you were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, no, and again, I distinctly remember that when I was a master's student, I did a particular assessment which I found incredibly challenging on some advanced form of syntax, and when I handed it in, it came back with a distinction level mark, which I was really chuffed about, because it was probably the most challenging piece of work I've ever done in my academic career. And syntax and grammar are not things in terms of my linguistic expertise that I do. But I remember the tutor who'd actually said, she actually said words to the effect of, considering your strengths as a linguist, I find this to be an excellent piece of work. So I thought, great. Now, thanks so much for that opening clause there. You needn't have done that. But as a way of basically giving me a backhanded compliment, for she recognised that was not my area of strength. And so I'd had chosen to say, given that you're not actually a syntactician, given your field of linguistics, you've actually done an excellent piece of work. She could have just said, "You've done an excellent piece of work," and that would, I'd have been happy with that. But she felt, because she was that kind of person, she felt that she needed to put that in there, and it may or may not have been a backhanded compliment. I certainly anticipated it. I certainly took it as if it was.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground then over the course of our conversation so far. If our listeners wanted to find out more, are there any books or publications or authors or videos, or what resources? There's a better question for you, Phil. What resources would you suggest for people to, if they wanted to know more about some of the areas that we talked about today?
Okay, I mean, there have been one or two attempts by various colleagues, both within academia and outside of academia, to start talking about notions of politeness and, impoliteness and things like that. My suggestions would be to currently stick with the academic work. So Jonathan Culpepper in 2011 did an absolutely fantastic barnstorming piece of work on impoliteness. You'll notice, Phil, what I'm attempting to do is not, come across as immodest by kind of promoting my own stuff.
That's all
right. So, I mean, Jonathan Culpepper's 2011 work is actually really, really good. If people really want to basically plough through my own 2008 monograph on impoliteness, then that's absolutely fine. Mm-hmm. Claire Hardacre, who's actually starting to do work, or has been doing work for the last few years, but will shortly have her own monograph or academic work, and her non-academic work on trolling online. And so there's one or two things that are actually coming out basically outside of academia, where Claire's actually talking about trolling and online aggression. That's really good way of starting.
She's on my podcast guest list at the moment.
Good, yes.
I haven't secured it
she'll
yet,
be
but
great.
She's on my wish list of to get.
She'll be great. The one thing I would say is that there are one or two pieces of work out there. I'm going to be very careful what I say, but I am the owner of a copy of work by Lynn Truss, who is a journalist on politeness in British society.
Okay.
I'm afraid to say, whilst I found it an entertaining read, there's evidence that she's misunderstood the models and the theories about notions of positive and negative politeness.
Okay.
And therefore that suggests that her work could probably do with a second edition. I'll put it that way. Okay. If I'm trying to be as polite as possible, because I otherwise, I otherwise found it an entertaining read, if a little too, how can I put this, not rooted in what academic researchers actually found people in society are actually using in terms of notions of politeness. So be aware of that. Okay. That's not to say that I didn't like it. He says, trying to cover his back very carefully.
And so,
that's not to say I didn't like it. But,
was that misinterpretation of Brian Levinson type?
It was, yeah. I mean, she'd misunderstood the concepts, as you might do, on notions of positive politeness and negative politeness. Yeah. She'd misunderstood what those concepts actually meant, because, of course, we've got in our head a schema of that positive means good and negative means bad. And rather than basically, how Brian Levinson used the terms.
Yeah, which is about positive being about reinforcement and acceptance. And
your desire for approval, about your freedom of imposition, exactly. So she'd misunderstood those and she'd misrepresented them. Other than that, it was a particularly interesting read, if a little too, non-secured in the academic research.
Okay. All right.
And then, of course, you can always get hold of a copy of the Journal of Politeness Research, Volume 14, Issue 2, which is on politeness and impoliteness in professional contexts.
Indeed, and I think there's a number of different papers that are in that particular special edition.
Oh, and some fantastic ones in there as well. Absolutely. Not. I'm not including my own, of course.
No, not me.
No. But the beauty of that is that it's almost like academic work is actually coming full circle. So it's no longer just drawing from what's actually going on in society, and formalising and recognising what's going on. It's now basically it's almost like it's trying to identify good practice in certain areas. Yeah. Put it on a firm academic footing, and then suggest, look, there are these settings which have effectively used notions of politeness, or have effectively dealt with impoliteness in these particular types of settings, and then here it is. If this is something that you want to adopt into your own policies, or you want to adopt into your own, or kind of working practices, or adopt into your own training mechanisms, this is what's worked elsewhere. So I think that's really the value of this particular special edition, and that's really what we were intending with it. Yeah.
I managed to get hold of 3 of the different papers from that special edition, and I agree there is some really interesting work happening in terms of how can we not just report on what's happening, but also progress that and take that further on to say, okay, well, now rather than just report what's happening, how can that be used and how can that help and support and enable communication and understanding within the workplace. So that's good, really good. Are there any misconceptions that you'd like to clear up that you haven't cleared up already?
Wow. I don't know. Is there anything I've said, or is anything from which I've represented in the theory and the practice from an academic perspective potentially not as clear as it could be for your regular podcast listeners?
Not that I can think of. I guess, are there any kind of I suppose what I was more thinking, rather than thinking about your contributions within the discussion we've had today, I was more thinking about general, are there general myths out there in the big wide world?
Yeah.
So we talked about one, for example, like power as an example. That was one that we talked about. Are there any other myths or misrepresentations that you think would be useful to address?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the whole point of discussing banter, I guess, is that notions of things which appear to be offensive language are not always bad. But by the same token, things which appear to be positive language, which you would actually identify in the notions of, kind of social notions of positive, I should say, in the notions as you'd identify the notions of politeness, doesn't necessarily mean it's good. There are many cases in which people can use politeness to signal very clearly or to subtly suggest anything other than a polite attitude towards somebody else. And there are many documented cases of this, both kind of not only in kind of fictional drama but in real life, where people are kind of potentially what we might actually call overly polite, and it's obvious to others that they are being challenging to obsequious by the use of or otherwise aggressive by the use of over politeness. And there are many cases of that, and the interesting thing about that is, who's ever going to complain about somebody being overly polite to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had it in the past where the requests for assistance or requests for work to be completed are responded with things similar to "yes sir, of course sir, 3 bags full sir" type thing, but said with in a way that implies assent, but actually with an undertone of dissent behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've occasionally received them myself. I mean, one of the favourites from one of my actually more senior members of staff is that if I ask him to do something which I suspect may not necessarily be as popular with him and his team as they might actually like, he has a particular habit of saying, "Well, you're the boss."
Okay.
And it's I've never actually tackled him about whether or not he's being sincere, because and this might actually be of interest as well. I suspect he is, there's a level of, kind of permissible insubordination behind that phrase. But you know what? His team usually then gets their heads down. On the rare occasions I have to ask them to do things that they otherwise might not want to do, they get their heads down, they do it effectively, and everybody benefits. So why would I want to rock the boat?
Yeah. That's a good example. I like that. Okay. Are there, beyond Claire then, because we talked about Claire already, are there any other anybody else that you think would be a good guest to track down to get on the podcast?
Absolutely. I think if you're interested in notions of kind of politeness and impoliteness from kind of an additional perspective, then I would suggest Professor Jonathan Culpepper I mentioned earlier on. Dr. Claire Hardacre, absolutely for trolling online and the use of and combating against trolling online, up to and including basically how trolling is actually dealt with in various social media sites, as well as the kind of the real world impacts. I think definitely Claire. If you're interested in looking at cross-cultural notions of politeness, then Gillian House or Gudrun Held would be really good in those particular perspectives.
Would you be able to either message me, or I want to make sure I get spellings correct, if that's okay?
No problem. I can send you contact details. That's absolutely fine.
Lovely, thank you.
And there's any number of colleagues that you could find for any number of areas. I mean, if you're interested in looking at notions of language, politeness, identity, in interaction, then Pilar Garces Conayes would be really good. Again, I can send you details.
Please.
And notions of basically, well, I would find it interesting. I'm not sure your podcasters would, but notions of how you do politeness in what's known as Maori and Pakeha relationships. That's Maori in New Zealand, and Pakeha is a Maori word for European settlers. And basically the kind of how politeness is kind of politeness between two what are now seen as equal partnership cultures growing ever closer together. Then there are colleagues at kind of the University of Wellington in New Zealand that are working on research in that area. There's any number of things that any number of people I can put you in touch with for any number of aspects that you want to look at. If it's cross-cultural, intercultural, if it's kind of power relations, if it's notions of impoliteness, notions of trolling, absolutely. Let me know. I could spend an hour talking, enthusiastically and at length about, my colleagues' research globally. If regular podcast listeners basically have any particular interests of what they may want to see that they want to kind of let you know, Phil, and then you want to let me know, I'm sure there'll be somebody who's doing quality research on it that I can put you in touch with.
Well, there you go then, fair listener. There's an open invitation for you to suggest some areas around what Derek and I have talked about today. That we can explore some more. I was going to be really cheeky and use your family abbreviation name for a moment there, and I caught myself. I thought, no, I won't. I'll be good.
We've had a really friendly conversation. Let's not
ruin it now.
By a bit of misfire banter. Absolutely.
All right. Well, in that case, then I'll bring the podcast to a close and say, Dr. Bagsfield, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, been really helpful just to sort of pull apart, but then also put back together the three key notions that we talked about today around banter and impoliteness and power. So thank you.
No, and it's been absolutely my pleasure, Phil. And please call me Derek.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Derek.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.